Thank you. Further debate. I recognize the member from Cambridge.
Thank you, Speaker, for the opportunity to participate in this Take Note debate. There are 4 areas I'd like to focus on. First, I'd like to address the format of a Take Note debate for such government legislation. Second, these emergency declarations. Third, this report is missing any type of cost-benefit analysis or data to show the efficacy of the orders implemented. And finally, I'd like to specifically focus on Enforcement Regulation 8/21. I find the format of a Take Note debate to be used to discuss this unprecedented use of emergency powers totally inadequate. To review, a Take Note debate is used in Parliament to allow members to give their perspective to the other members of the House, and perhaps to inform the government of a different perspective, but without any questioning or exchange occurring and without a vote being held, and without the legislature having to make a decision on the matter. In general, the imposition of government on the day-to-day lives of Ontarians requires a fuller debate than this. The decision to call a stay-at-home order requires more than just this legislature taking note and canvassing the opinions of members. It should require a full debate with a vote every time this government decides such measures. Unfortunately, thanks to the Reopening Ontario Act, which should have been called the Lockdown Act, and every single government member voting away their own rights and handing it over to the Premier for the last year and a half, all we have is a Take Note debate to review and challenge the government, a debate the government doesn't even need to respond to, and the Premier and this government can continue to make these decisions in private without a vote or a full debate. In effect, this legislature and its members have been muted as a result of that legislation, and we haven't even seen effective results with this power grab, as we are now into our 3rd emergency declaration in a year and a half, and all the members can do is offer up their opinion in the form of a Take Note debate. Totally inadequate. In addition, the timing of this debate makes the Take Note debate totally moot. We are holding this debate 4 months after the emergency declaration started that this report is based on, and well into our 3rd emergency declaration. As a result, there is no interest in this government to get the feedback from members or this legislature. In fact, the timing of this debate, which is supposed to canvass opinions from elected members, shows a contempt for this legislature and the democratic process. Perhaps if these debates were held earlier, we would have provided more clarity to Ontarians, or we could discuss provisions that were in overreach prior to them coming into effect, and then watching the government reverse course, further frustrating and confusing Ontarians. But the Premier apparently has it all figured out. He doesn't take kindly to criticism or other perspectives. He doesn't, his cabinet doesn't, and they don't provide an opportunity for discourse, as is most evident with me sitting as a new Blue Party member in this House, and as further evidenced by this debate occurring months after the declaration was started. The second item I'd like to address is the fact that the orders made under the 2nd emergency declaration are permitted to continue to live on as a result of the Reopening Ontario Act. The way emergency declarations are supposed to work, once the declaration is over, the orders go away. But as we see with this report, the Premier and his government, without the approval of the legislature, have the right to extend the orders for a period of time over a year, that many would say are more permanent than temporary. As a result, the temporary nature of emergency orders has been done away with. So it's no surprise Ontarians wonder, why are they calling these 2nd emergency declaration and 3rd emergency declarations and adding end dates to them? Because by their calculations and their lives, it feels like one long emergency declaration starting in early 2020 and continuing halfway through 2021. And in some substance, they would be correct, because many of the emergency orders found in these emergency declarations continue on after the declaration ends. This doesn't provide clarity to Ontarians as to what is going on, or the timing of when things will end, or the government's intentions. It clouds everyone's understanding, making it sound like an emergency declaration has come to an end, but then continuing on with certain orders made under that declaration only adds to the level of frustration and distrust of Ontarians. Speaker, such a report on the 2nd emergency declaration, since it is happening 3 months later, most voters would assume it would include some kind of cost-benefit analysis or some kind of result on the efficacy of the measures introduced. But this report lacks this analysis of the effectiveness of these orders entirely. Recently, a few studies have been published analyzing the effectiveness of lockdown measures and stay-at-home orders. Dr. Ari Joffe of the University of Alberta published a paper suggesting lockdown harms are 10 times greater than the benefits. Another study from Stanford University took a look at non-pharmaceutical interventions such as stay-at-home orders and business closures used in European jurisdictions. The 4 researchers concluded they did not see significant benefits to severe restrictions, and that similar reductions in case growth may be achievable with less restrictive interventions. Another study of 5 researchers, all from different universities, from Toronto to Greece to Texas, found that increasing caseloads had more to do with obesity rates and the lapse in time to border closures from the first reported case. The latter is something this government had no problem with last year when border controls could have slowed the spread, but the Premier was too busy praising the Prime Minister for doing a great job, rather than pushing him to respond with proper border controls. And most recently, a study out of Simon Fraser University reviewing over 80 studies concluded that research done over the past 6 months has shown that lockdowns have had at best a marginal effect on COVID deaths, and the ineffectiveness of lockdowns is partly due to the voluntary change in behaviour by citizens. Lockdown jurisdictions were not able to prevent non-compliance, and non-lockdown jurisdictions benefited from voluntary changes in behaviour that mimicked lockdowns. The limited effectiveness of lockdown explains why after 1 year, the unconditional cumulative deaths per million and the pattern of daily deaths per million is not negatively correlated with the stringency of lockdown across countries. And there are other studies out there that we should be reviewing and considering when making such unprecedented decisions and draconian measures. But instead, this government doesn't provide a cost-benefit analysis in its report, even though this debate is taking place 4 months after the second stay-at-home orders were implemented. Wouldn't it be nice if we had that? Some numbers or data on the effectiveness of these measures? Why are they being done again and again and again? Why are caseloads going up repeatedly, even though we are now on stay-at-home order number 3? Why are other jurisdictions returning to normal while in Ontario we're getting worse? Worse results, more draconian measures, OPP officers threatening parents with calls to Children's Aid. Where is the science to look at to inform the debate? It is missing from this report. The science, the data is missing probably most likely because the government isn't looking at any science. So what can we say about the 32 stay-at-home orders implemented in late January, 4 months later in this Take Note debate? Not much, because we have no attempt from this government to assess the effectiveness, look at data, provide a cost-benefit, nothing. It is just draconian decisions and Ontarians must accept it. That's not good enough. Finally, I'd like to focus on Ontario Regulation 8/21 on enforcement. This emergency declaration saw a further expansion of power given to provincial offences officers, of which some would argue is entirely inappropriate for their training and for their purpose. 3 powers were granted on provincial offences officers: the power to gather information on citizens, power to end a public gathering or disperse a crowd, power to temporarily close a premises that might be at the site of a number of people gathering together. We've seen enforcement measures get worse and more over the top since the second declaration to the third, providing evidence that the caution to the slippery slope that is state intrusion is a compelling argument, as this government has shown a lack of refrain in imposing itself on Ontarians with little beneficial results to show for it. Because in the second emergency, those enforcing the orders had to have reasonable grounds to compel citizens for information or to close a premise or disperse a gathering. But as I previously said in the House, by the third, even the reasonable grounds requirement was done away with, so provincial officers could just demand whatever information they wanted, even without having reasonable grounds to demand the information. And previously mentioned, this enforcement order, Regulation 8/21, was extended and continued even after the emergency declaration ended. As troubling as this enforcement measure is, the draconian powers given to a wide variety of provincial offences officers over citizens, another element we have seen over the last 4 months as to why this regulation is troubling, is a randomness or inconsistent application of its use. One principle of our legal system is that laws are to be applied equally, yet it has become very clear that this enforcement regulation and others since then are not being applied the same. They are being applied by provincial offences officers to target and ticket those who protest the stay-at-home and lockdown orders. But if citizens gather for any other purpose, enforcement regulations are not being followed. But that isn't how the regulation is drafted. It's supposed to be applied to everyone, which begs the question, is this enforcement regulation being used as a means to control a virus or as a political tool to punish those, including politicians, who disagree with government policy? When you see protests on international matters or other political issues where fines are not issued and the premises are not blocked off, but smaller protests are punished with fines, it is easy to see why people think they are being silenced from criticizing the government. Such broad enforcement powers as included in this regulation are troubling, not only because it infringes on civil liberties, but because by their very nature they are not going to be applied equally. Enforcement is impossible. Mr. Speaker, I would like to conclude by saying that I am concerned about the precedent that we, as elected public servants representing the voters, have and continue to set on our future generations on how our democracy operates and what our government can and cannot do. A truly unprecedented overreach of government, a power grab, one that we have never seen before in Ontario history, and one that is not getting better but getting worse, from a government that can't seem to help itself and that is getting tired. The decisions continue to harm the livelihood of Ontario residents and their health. The cure is increasingly looking worse than the disease. And finally, these measures have set a precedent that puts the democratic system in this province and the function of this legislature, two things that we all take for granted, at risk. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.